clay. So you've got some natural clay and you want to know how to use it. The thing is, there's all kinds of information out there, and there's actually a lot of misinformation about how to process natural clay. So I'm going to set the record straight once and for all right here. We're going to dry process clay, we're going to wet process clay. I'm going to record it all, I'm going to time it, and then we're going to see which one is most efficient. Let's get started. So the way it works, I've got myself a little grinder here. This is a corn grinder. It's a Mexican corn grinder. You can use anything. Lots of people use just like a metate, which is like a grinding stone. You can use a hammer, you know, on like a concrete slab or on a rock. There's a lot of ways of grinding the clay up. In this grinder I use, the clay has to be in like marble-sized chunks. If the clay is too big, it won't go through the grinder correctly. So if it is big, I do have to, you know, break it up with a hammer or something first. So I just load the hopper up with a little bit of clay. I don't get it too full because I don't want it to, if I have problems, to be backed up. And then I adjust it here for how fine I want it ground. This is important. When I first started using it, I would grind it up and then I would pass it through a piece of window screen to remove the larger pieces. But I found that I can adjust it to the right size here, and then I don't have to filter it later. It's already ground to a small enough size that would pass through any window screen. So that's how much time and labor is involved in processing a quart of clay. I usually mix in 20% temper, so that's a 4-to-1 ratio. So I just use a scoop. Any size scoop is fine, as long as it's proportional to the amount of clay you have, meaning that if I had, you know, 10 gallons of clay, I wouldn't want to scoop it with one of these. I'd be at it all day. Likewise, if I have a quart of clay like this, I don't want to use a humongous scoop, or I can't do it either. So that's 1, 2, 3, and that's about 4 scoops, and then give it a scoop of sand. And then what's this? Maybe about 1 other scoop. So then I want about a 1/5 of that. So just a little more sand and we're good. It's not rocket science. And then this is really the beauty of the dry process, and that is that I can mix my sand and my clay together just like this. Real easy. Whereas with the wet process, when I'm ready to mix in my temper, it takes a lot of kneading to get that temper mixed all the way through. And then just to make sure that I compare apples to apples, I'm going to go ahead and wet this. Although a lot of times I'll mix this up ahead of time and I'll just store it dry like this with the temper and the clay mixed together in a bucket and then just wet it as I need it. But in this case, we're comparing it to the wet process, which produces wet clay. So we'll add this in just to make sure we're fair. I'm just going to leave this sit here for a little while and air dry. It got kind of damp. Processing clay using the wet method involves getting the clay into a liquid suspension with water and then straining out the impurities, which also means that then you have the additional step of getting that moisture out of the clay until it becomes a plastic body. Tell you the ingredients we need. First of all, we need some way to mix the clay. Now, I'm going to use the drill to mix it, but you can mix it by hand. It just takes a little longer to slake that clay down into a liquid. Of course, you need your clay. Then you need something to screen it with. You can use a piece of window screen. You can buy those little ceramic supply houses, sell these little screens that fit right on top of a 5-gallon bucket, which are really convenient. These are paint strainer bags. You can get them at the hardware store. And it's basically just cheesecloth with a piece of elastic on it so that it fits right over the top of a 5-gallon bucket. And then you have to have some way of getting that moisture out of the clay. Once you've created that liquid suspension, you then have to remove most of the liquid. What I use is an old pillowcase. So I just go to a thrift store, buy a pillowcase. I put it over the top of the bucket. I pour the liquid clay into it. Then I let it sit in the sun for a few days to evaporate out the extra water. So let's get started with that wet process. So I just dump it in the bucket and I'm just going to add water, quite a bit of water because I want to make it really liquid. I don't want it to be thick. Just feeling in there, and there's no chunks of clay left. Only chunks I feel are bits of sand and gravel. So that's good, that's what you want. You want all the clay particles to be suspended in the water. So once you've got it all mixed up, you can let it sit for a second, but you don't want to let it sit for very long because we're not levigating, we're just straining. So you need 2 buckets. Take your paint strainer bag and put it over the second bucket. Make sure it's clean and doesn't have any junk in it because anything that's in the bucket is going to end up in your clay body. Go ahead and make sure you got it all because anything that is sand or gravel is going to get filtered out in the strainer anyway. Obviously, if you have a lot of clay, this is going to take a little longer to get it all worked through this mesh. And sometimes if you have a lot of junk in the mesh, you have to pull it out, dump it back in the first bucket, clean the strainer out, hose it out, and do it again because it'll get gunked up to the point where you're not getting any more clay through it. So now that I've got that all separated out, everything in the bucket is clay suspended in water. We're just going to let it set for a little bit. And maybe within, it depends on the clay, but within half hour or so, the clay will have settled some and there'll be a layer of clear water on top that you can pour off. And you want to do that to get it kind of compressed before you put it in here because you're going to lose some of it through seepage right away. And so the thicker the material is, the clay, the more that you're going to hold in your pillowcase. So we'll let it sit there for a little bit and come back to it. Okay, so this has sat for a little bit and we've got some water at the top, maybe not crystal clear water, but it is water and the clay layer is below it. You can kind of see it's just dirty. So I'm just going to pour gently so that I don't stir up the clay that's already settled. Just pour that water off of there. And you can see that layer of clay as it starts getting up towards the lip of the bucket. And just gently kind of ease off on it so you don't pour out your clay. Oh, that was an accident. See how that stirred it up? That's what you don't want to do. And we've got some oozing out, as I said we would. All right, so I've got my quart of clay here sitting in the pillowcase, and I'll just let it sit here for, it'll be It'll be no sooner than tomorrow afternoon probably. And I live in a dry climate, so if you're in a wetter climate, it'll take even longer before it's usable. But I'll come out and check on it, you know, every 8 hours or so, just to make sure it doesn't get too dry. Sometimes you have to turn it over so, you know, it's drying more on the top than on the bottom, just to make sure that you don't end up with really hard chunks of clay in there that are unusable. Okay, so this sat out in my yard for about 40 hours. And it may be still too soft, but we're going to go ahead and see what we can do with it. Now, remember that I live in Tucson, and the climate is pretty dry, so your mileage may vary depending on where you live. If you live someplace moist like Louisiana or Washington, you know, it's going to take a lot longer. Not too bad, not too bad. It doesn't have any hard chunks, that's the main thing. A lot of times when you let it dry outside for a long time, it won't be evenly dried. There'll be hard chunks and soft pieces. Now the difficulty to me in tempering moist clay is you kind of have to eyeball it. So I'm thinking 20%, you know, what's about 20% of this? Less than a third, less than a quarter, but close, but very close to a quarter, you know. So I don't know a better way to do it, unfortunately. Now, when it comes to comparing the amount of labor between the two processes, when you're grinding it, the predominant portion of labor, the hard labor, is grinding. Whereas in the wet processing, the hardest labor is the kneading. Okay, so that's it. I have to admit, I'm a little surprised by the size of my lumps of clay here. Now, I added some dry to this because if you remember right when I mixed this up, this is the dry processed. When I mixed this up, it was very wet. So I added some more dry clay to it. But look at the size of the lumps. In comparison, it's twice as much. And I did not add another, you know, 100% of the clay to it. And with the wet process, because it was very liquid when I poured it into the pillowcase, some of it leaked out. But again, I didn't think it was that much. These were measured. These were measured by volume before I ground them up. So there could have been some difference, you know, because it was volume and not weight. But that's a pretty sizable. You know, there's still some bits of clay clinging to the bag here, you know, and I could go through and, I mean, you can see they're falling off. I could get some more clay out of this, but again, is it that much clay? Okay, so that's your comparison. I wish I had a scale here that we could weigh these and see the difference, but there is a tremendous difference in volume of clay. Like I said, it's about twice as much. Okay, the numbers are in. 13 minutes for the dry processing the quart of clay, and 17 minutes for wet processing the same quart of clay. Of course, we saw the results and they're not exactly even either. And there's a lot of other things to take into account. The quality of your clay, you know, the working quality of the clay after it's processed, what type of the work, you know, is easiest for you. For example, the dry processing saves on kneading, but adds the grinding process, which can be a lot of hard work. So there's a lot of things to take into account. But for me, the odds-on favorite is dry processing clay for speed, for ease of use, you know, for being able to store my clay dry, for not having to worry about where I put that pillowcase full of clay, that it doesn't get rained on, dry out, and having to check on it and turn it every once in a while. It's just less trouble to dry process as far as I'm concerned. But hey, everybody has their own feelings about what they like and what works best for them. So leave your comments down below in the comment section. I'd be glad to hear what process you prefer and why. So don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and we'll catch you next time. Thanks for watching.